Once upon a time, a homeless girl corrected the calculations of a millionaire. He laughed, but then was shocked. Secrets came to light, and their lives changed forever. A story that will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment where you are watching from. Chapter 1. The Empire of Concrete and Coldness. The January sun beat down on the streets of Upper East Side with that typical intensity of New York summer. But inside the air-conditioned office on the 32nd floor of Walker Tower, Robert Henry Walker hardly noticed the heat. At 57, the construction magnate had transformed that environment into his personal kingdom, a fortress of glass and steel where he commanded an empire valued at over $2 billion. The walls of the office displayed photographs of his greatest ventures: luxury condominiums in Malibu, corporate complexes in Silicon Valley, shopping centers scattered across the country. Each image represented not only financial achievements, but personal victories over competitors who underestimated his ability to turn vacant lots into real cities. Mr. Walker, the audit documents for the Central Park project are ready for your review, announced Sarah, his secretary for 15 years, placing a stack of folders on the solid mahogany desk that dominated the center of the room. Robert didn't lift his eyes from the spreadsheets he was examining with a jeweler's loupe. His obsession with details was legendary in the company. From the simplest screws to million-dollar contracts, everything passed through his personal scrutiny. "Leave it here. I'll review every comma before signing anything," he murmured, adjusting the prescription glasses he insisted on wearing only in the office, considering it a sign of weakness in front of his employees. Through the panoramic window, the movement of the streets resembled an organized anthill. Robert occasionally observed the pedestrians below, especially during the last weeks of December, when families gathered on the sidewalks for traditional neighborhood Secret Santa gatherings. Those expressions of popular camaraderie always caused him a mix of disdain and incomprehension. "Cheap sentimentality," he used to comment with partners during dinners at the New York Athletic Club. "While they waste time with these nonsense, we build the future of this city." His philosophy of life was crystal clear. Emotions were for the weak, relationships were strategic, and success was measured exclusively in bank numbers and acquired properties. This calculated coldness had cost him his marriage 10 years ago. His ex-wife, Helena, could no longer bear living with a man who treated family like a business and feelings as unnecessary expenses. The only relationship he still maintained was with his daughter, Isabella, 28 years old, a graduate in architecture from Columbia University. But even that interaction was tense and infrequent. The young woman had inherited her father's intelligence, but completely rejected his materialistic values, preferring to work on social projects rather than accept a position in the family construction company. "Dad, you turned everything into numbers. You forgot that there are people behind every apartment you build," she had said during their last argument, last Christmas. Since then, they barely spoke. On that suffocating January afternoon, Robert decided to personally go down to the parking lot to retrieve a folder left in the car. It was unusual. He normally delegated such tasks to employees, but the importance of the documents for the new project in Brooklyn justified breaking protocol. The building's parking lot was a refrigerated underground environment, with spaces marked for each executive according to a strict hierarchy. His black Tesla Model S occupied the spot closest to the elevators, identified with a golden plaque, President R.H. Walker. While rummaging through the glove compartment for the documentation, a child's voice made him look up abruptly. "Excuse me, sir. You dropped some papers." A girl of about 8 years old stood next to the car, holding some sheets that had slipped from his hands. Her clothes were simple, but impeccably clean. A faded pink shirt, a denim skirt, and rubber sandals that had seen better days. Her brown hair was tied in two neat braids, and her brown eyes sparkled with an intelligence uncommon for her age. "How did you get in here? This parking lot is private," Robert replied, more surprised than irritated. The building's security was strict, and the presence of an unaccompanied child was absolutely unusual. "I live in the building across the street, sir. I was playing on the sidewalk when I saw the papers flying. My grandma always says we should help people," she explained, extending the sheets with the seriousness of an adult. Robert took the documents, preparing to dismiss the girl with a formal word of thanks when she pointed to one of the spreadsheets in his hands. "Sir, there's a mistake in these numbers here." The statement was so unexpected that he almost laughed. "What do you mean?" "There, in this calculation," she said, pointing with her little finger to a specific line of the spreadsheet. 4,300,000 plus 2,700,000 doesn't equal 6,800,000. It equals 7 million. Robert's blood ran cold. That was one of the most important spreadsheets for the Brooklyn project, reviewed by 3 engineers and 2 accountants. He grabbed the calculator from the car and recalculated. The girl was absolutely right. Do you know how to do these calculations?" he stammered, genuinely bewildered for the first time in decades. "I like numbers. Grandma says I was born knowing how to count," she replied naturally, as if solving calculations of millions was the most common thing in the world. Robert looked again at the spreadsheet, then at the girl, then back at the numbers. The error she had detected could have cost nearly $1 million in miscalculated budget. His engineers, with years of experience and diplomas hanging on the walls, had overlooked a mistake that an 8-year-old had identified in seconds. "What's your name?" he asked for the first time in his life, addressing a child with genuine respect. "Emily, but everyone calls me—" Daisy called. "And you, sir?" "Robert," he replied automatically, completely forgetting the titles and formalities he always demanded. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Robert. I need to go back now because Grandma must be worried. But if you want, I can help check the other papers tomorrow. I really like math." She walked away with quick steps, crossing the street towards a modest 4-story apartment building that violently contrasted with the luxury buildings dominating that region of the Upper East Side. Robert remained still for long minutes, holding the corrected spreadsheet and trying to process what had just happened. In 57 years of life, building an empire based on mathematical precision and absolute control, he had never imagined that a child in flip-flops could shake the foundations of his self-confidence so easily. That night, alone in his mansion in Beverly Hills, he couldn't sleep. The image of the girl and her extraordinary ability mixed with a strange and uncomfortable sensation he hadn't felt in a long time. Humility. Chapter 2. Numbers and Discoveries. The following week brought an unease that Robert had never experienced. Sitting in his Italian leather armchair, he found himself gazing out the window towards the building where he had met Emily, as if waiting to catch a glimpse of the girl again. It was a dangerous distraction for someone who had built his fortune on absolute concentration. "Mr. Walker, the meeting with the Japanese investors is scheduled for 10 o'clock, announced Sarah, interrupting his daydreams. "Cancel it," he said abruptly, surprising the secretary who knew of his obsession with international commitments. "Reschedule for Thursday. I have a personal matter to attend to." It was a lie. He had no matter at all, just a curiosity that was growing like an infected wound. He needed to understand how a child had managed to identify an error that had gone unnoticed by experienced professionals. It was a matter of business pride, he justified to himself. In reality, it was something much deeper and more disturbing. Around noon, Robert went down to the parking lot again, this time deliberately carrying a folder full of complex spreadsheets. He pretended to fiddle with his car, waiting. 15 minutes later, as if fate answered a silent request, he saw Emily crossing the street with a school notebook under her arm. "Mr. Robert," she exclaimed, waving with the genuine enthusiasm that only children possess. "You're back!" "Good morning, Daisy. I was passing by and, well, yesterday you said you like math. I have some calculations here that are giving me trouble. Could you take a look?" The girl's eyes sparkled as if he had offered her the best Christmas gift. "Of course, I love challenges with numbers." Robert opened the folder and showed a budget spreadsheet for a shopping center in San Diego, complex numbers involving square footage, material costs, labor, and profit margin. It was the kind of calculation that took his teams 2 hours to process. Emily examined the numbers with the seriousness of an experienced auditor. Her lips moved silently as she processed the information, her small finger tracing the rows of digits. "This one is wrong," she said after 3 minutes, pointing to a value in the finishes column. "And this one too. If you add everything correctly, the total is $800,000 cheaper than what's written." Robert quickly checked on the calculator. Again, she was right. His heart raced, not only because of the mathematical precision, but also because of the financial implication. That difference represented substantial savings that would significantly increase the project's profit margin. "How do you do that so quickly?" he asked, genuinely impressed. "I can't explain it well. The numbers talk to me, you know. It's like they tell a story, and when something doesn't add up, I notice right away." An elderly woman, around 60 years old, appeared at the door of the building, wearing a simple printed cotton dress and house slippers. Her grey hair was tied up in a simple bun, and her expression showed a mix of concern and distrust. "Daisy, how many times have I told you not to talk to strangers?" she called, crossing the street with firm steps. "Grandma, this is Mr. Robert. He has some really cool math problems to solve." The woman approached with the cautious dignity of someone who had learned to protect her own without showing fear. Robert immediately realized he was being assessed by the experienced gaze of someone who knew the dangers of the world. "Good afternoon. I'm Mrs. Johnson, Emily's grandmother. And you are—" "Robert Walker. I'm a businessman. I work in the building across the street. Your granddaughter has an extraordinary talent for math." Mrs. Johnson narrowed her eyes. The surname Walker was well known in Los Angeles. It was emblazoned on construction signs throughout the city. But that did not impress her. On the contrary, it increased her distrust. "My granddaughter is a normal child, Mr. Walker. I don't know what interest you might have in her, but I would appreciate it if you kept your distance." The coldness in Mrs. Johnson's voice cut Robert like a blade. Throughout his life, he had become accustomed to the automatic respect that money and status provided. It was the first time someone treated him with open suspicion, protecting something more valuable than any business. "Mrs. Johnson, I have no improper intentions. It's just that, well, your granddaughter identified errors in important documents for my company. Errors that my engineers couldn't detect." "And what do you intend to do with that?" she asked, discreetly placing herself between Robert and the girl. Actually, I don't know. I've never encountered a situation like this." The unexpected honesty in Robert's response seemed to partially disarm Mrs. Johnson's defenses. She studied his face for a few seconds, searching for signs of falsehood or manipulation. "Grandma, he just wants help with the numbers." "There's nothing wrong," Daisy interjected, with the innocence of someone who still doesn't fully understand the complexities of adults. "Emily, go home and prepare lunch. Now, young lady." The authority in the grandmother's voice allowed for no argument. Daisy said goodbye. Robert waved goodbye to Daisy and ran towards the building, leaving the two adults alone on the sidewalk. "Mr. Walker, I will be clear with you. We raised Daisy with a lot of love and protection after we lost her parents in a car accident 3 years ago. She is everything I have in this world. I will not allow anyone, no matter how important they are, to take advantage of a child's innocence. I understand your concern, Mrs. Johnson. I can assure you that I have no intention of harming your granddaughter. But you need to understand that her talent it's something extraordinary. Perhaps it should be developed properly. Developed by whom? By you? A wealthy man who appears out of nowhere showing interest in a poor girl? Forgive my frankness, but I know this world better than you can imagine. There was a hardness in Mrs. Johnson's, a voice that suggested bitter experiences with people from a higher social class. Robert felt inexplicably embarrassed, as if he were being judged by criteria he was completely unaware of. Mrs. Johnson, you just nothing. Good afternoon, Mr. Walker. She turned her back and entered the building, leaving Robert alone on the sidewalk with his spreadsheets and a strange feeling of rejection. Never in his life had he been dismissed so categorically, especially by a simple woman who, according to his worldview, should feel honored by the attention of someone of his status. As he returned to his office, a question hammered in his head. What exactly did Mrs. Johnson mean by "I know this world better than you can imagine"? There was something in the way she pronounced those words that suggested personal knowledge, not just assumptions. That night, Robert did something he hadn't done in years. He called his daughter. "Isabella, I need to talk to you about something strange that happened today." "Dad, are you okay? Since when do you call me to talk about something other than work?" The irony in his daughter's voice hurt him more than he was willing to admit, but for some reason he couldn't explain. He needed to share that experience with someone. "I met a girl today, a child with extraordinary mathematical talent, but her grandmother treated me like I was some kind of predator." "And you were surprised by that? Dad, you're a rich and powerful man approaching a poor child. Of course the family would be suspicious. You don't understand how the real world works outside your bubble of privilege." The casual cruelty in Isabella's observation left him speechless. For the second time that day, he was confronted with a reality he had always ignored. Perhaps his social position was not a calling card, but a barrier. "Isabella, do you think I am a bad person?" The silence that followed was more eloquent than any response. Chapter 3. Scars of the past February arrived with the suffocating heat that precedes Carnival. But Robert barely noticed the changes in the weather. For the past 15 days, he had developed the disturbing habit of altering his routine to pass by the street where Daisy lived. It wasn't stalking, he justified to himself. It was just intellectual curiosity about an inexplicable mathematical phenomenon. In truth, it was pure obsession. On that Ash Wednesday, as he returned from yet another casual pass through the neighborhood, he found Isabella waiting in the reception area of his company. At 28, his daughter had inherited her father's determination, but she directed that strength toward causes he considered unproductive. She wore a simple cotton blouse, jeans, and flats, the unofficial uniform of social architects who despised ostentation. "We need to talk," she said, without any polite preambles. "If it's about that affordable housing project in East Los Angeles, I've already told you I won't finance utopian dreams," Robert replied, heading toward the elevators. "It's not about my projects, Dad. It's about you." Something in Isabella's tone made him stop. For years, their conversations followed a predictable script. She would ask for support for social projects. He would refuse with economic arguments, and both would part frustrated. But there was a different seriousness in his daughter's voice. In the office, Isabella examined the photographs of developments on the walls, as if she were seeing them for the first time. "Remember when I was 8 years old and you took me to construction sites on weekends? Of course, you loved seeing the buildings rise from the ground up. I loved spending time with you, Dad, not with the buildings. You're the one who didn't understand the difference." Robert helped himself to coffee from the imported Italian machine that dominated a corner of the office. The ritual gave him time to process the unexpected turn of the conversation. "Isabella, where are you going with this?" "My secretary, Carmen, lives in the Upper East Side. She told me you've been hanging around a little girl's house. She said even the girl's grandmother has complained to the building manager." Blood rushed to Robert's face. "I'm not hanging around anyone. It's a complex situation that you wouldn't understand. Then explain it to me, because to everyone watching, it looks like a 57-year-old man is stalking an 8-year-old girl." The implied accusation was so outrageous that Robert felt like throwing his daughter out of the office. But something in Isabella's expression, a mix of genuine concern and old sadness, prevented him from exploding. "The girl has an extraordinary talent for mathematics. She identified errors in spreadsheets that my engineers couldn't detect. It's a phenomenon that needs to be studied." "Studied or exploited? How dare you?" "Dad, have you ever done anything for someone without expecting something in return? Have you ever helped someone because they needed it, not because you would gain something from it?" The question echoed in the office like a gunshot. Robert opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. He tried to remember a single act of genuine generosity in his 5 decades of adult life, but found only emptiness. I create jobs. I generate income for thousands of people. Families. You build profits, Dad. Jobs are a consequence, not the goal." Isabella moved closer to the panoramic window, observing the bustling city below. "You know what saddens me the most? You don't even realize how you've become a caricature of yourself, a rich and lonely man who only knows how to relate through power and money. And you've turned into a naive idealist who thinks the world runs on good feelings," he retorted, wounded. "At least I still feel something, Dad. You've become a calculating machine dressed in a suit." The silence that followed was heavy with years of accumulated resentment. Father and daughter studied each other like strangers who had just met, recognizing physical similarities, but bewildered by the emotional distance. "Isabella, why are you really here?" She sighed deeply before responding. "Because I still hope that there's a father somewhere beneath this business armor, and because I'm worried that you'll do something foolish with that girl." "What kind of foolishness?" "I don't know. Offering money to her family, promising miraculous opportunities, trying to buy her talent like you would buy a new machine for the company." The accusation was so precise that Robert felt exposed. In fact, he had spent the last week mentally drafting proposals to properly develop Daisy's potential, all involving investments, contracts, and calculated returns. And what would be wrong with offering opportunities to the girl? The problem is that you don't know this family. You don't understand their needs, their values, their circumstances. You only see a talent that could be useful to you. Isabella grabbed her bag and headed for the door. "Dad, if you really want to help that child, start by learning to see her as a person, not as a human calculator." "And how do I do that?" "Start by asking yourself why her grandmother is so suspicious of men like you." After his daughter left, Robert remained alone in the office long after his usual hours. Isabella's words echoed in his mind, mingling with the memory of Mrs. Johnson's distrustful gaze and the categorical rejection he had received. On impulse, he opened his computer and typed Mrs. Johnson, Beverly Hills into the company's search system. His construction company kept detailed records of employees since the 1980s, including outsourced service providers. It was a corporate security practice, but it also fed his obsessive need for control. The name appeared in the files. Conceição Aparecida Silva, 62 years old, worked as a domestic service provider for various high-profile families between 1985 and 2010, Current address, 847 Marqués de Paranaguá Street, apartment 23. But it was the last record that made his blood run cold. From 1988 to 1995, Mrs. Johnson had worked as a housekeeper at the Walker family residence in Beverly Hills, his own home. His hands trembled as he accessed the older files. There was all the documentation, signed contracts, references, even photographs of the employees for the security archive. The Mrs. Johnson from 30 years ago had the same firm gaze, but her face was less marked by time and hardship. Fragments of memory began to emerge like pieces of a lost puzzle. A woman always dressed in a blue uniform who prepared his morning coffee before school. Caring hands that tended to his scrapes when he returned from tennis practice. A soft voice that calmed him during his teenage asthma crises. Mrs. Johnson was not a stranger. She was a forgotten part of his own history. And now he understood why she had said she knew his world better than he imagined. She had worked in his home for 7 years, closely observing the growing coldness of a family that treated employees like invisible furniture. He vaguely recalled her dismissal, something about restructuring the domestic staff when he was already in college. He had never wondered what happened to her afterward. Now he knew she had raised an orphaned granddaughter on the money from a modest pension in a simple apartment just a few blocks from the mansion where she had dedicated the best years of her professional life. And he, the boy she had cared for, had become exactly the kind of man she feared the most. Powerful, unpredictable, and dangerously interested in the only thing she had left in the world. For the first time in decades, Robert Henry Walker cried. Chapter 4. The Weight of Memories. The beginning of March brought the first rains of the autumn season in Los Angeles, and Robert discovered that the sound of water against the office windows awakened memories he had buried for decades. Sitting in his leather armchair, he watched the drops slide down the glass as fragments of the past emerged like reluctant ghosts. Mrs. Johnson at 30, wiping her tears when he returned from school with a torn uniform after a fight at school. Mrs. Johnson preparing oatmeal when he was bedridden with pneumonia for 2 weeks at 15. Mrs. Johnson being dismissed by his father with bureaucratic coldness, as if 7 years of dedication could be summed up in an envelope with a severance package. "Mr. Walker, you have a meeting with the Japanese in 10 minutes, announced Sarah, interrupting his musings. "Cancel it again. Tell them I had a family emergency." It wasn't entirely a lie. Discovering that the grandmother of the prodigy girl had been his former caregiver technically constituted a family emergency, but the truth was more complex. He needed to understand how that woman, who once cared for his well-being, now saw him as a threat. Around noon, he made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of trying for another casual meeting with Daisy, he headed directly to Mrs. Johnson's apartment. It was time to face the ghosts he had created. The Santa Monica apartments were a typical lower-middle-class building from the 1980s, with a brick facade and a poorly maintained garden at the entrance. The contrast with the luxurious buildings surrounding it was striking, as if that construction were a persistent reminder that not everyone in the Upper East Side lived in the same world. He climbed the stairs to the second floor as the elevator displayed a out-of-order sign that seemed permanent. The hallway smelled of cheap disinfectant and had institutional green walls that tried to disguise the age of the building. Apartment 23. He took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. Mrs. Johnson opened the door wearing a floral apron over a simple dress. When she saw who was outside, her expression shifted from cordial curiosity to instant suspicion. "What do you want in my house?" "Mrs. Johnson, I remembered. You worked at home when I was a teenager." She showed no surprise. "Of course you remembered. Otherwise you wouldn't have come here. Come in before the neighbors start talking." The two-bedroom apartment was impeccably clean and organized, but it couldn't hide the financial limitations. The living room sofa had covers to disguise the wear. The curtains were made of cheap fabric but carefully pressed, and the walls displayed photographs of Daisy in simple frames. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the aroma of powdered soap, creating an atmosphere of a humble home, lovingly cared for. "Have a seat," said Mrs. Johnson, pointing to an armchair that had seen better days. "I'll get some coffee. You don't need to bother. I always served coffee to people who came into my house. I'm not going to stop now." As she headed to the kitchen, Robert examined the surroundings. On the plywood shelf, among Daisy's schoolbooks, there was an old photograph in a golden frame, a young Mrs. Johnson wearing a blue uniform next to a blonde child of about 12 years old, himself, decades ago. Mrs. Johnson returned with a tray containing 2 cups of coffee and a plate of homemade cookies. Her movements maintained the discreet elegance he vaguely remembered. The upright posture, precise gestures, the care not to make unnecessary noise. "You remember me," he said, more as a statement than a question. "I remember the boy you were. Sensitive, caring, always worried when I caught a cold. The man you've become. That I don't recognize." The brutal honesty of the observation hit him like a punch to the stomach. "Mrs. Johnson, I didn't come here to—" "To what? To explain yourself? To justify yourself? To try to buy my silence by offering something to Daisy?" Robert swallowed hard. The woman knew his behavioral patterns better than he would like to admit. "I came because I need to understand. Why do you hate me so much?" Mrs. Johnson laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "I don't hate you, boy. I pity you." The word boy, pronounced with the same affectionate tone from 30 years ago, was more devastating than any insult. He felt his eyes burn and turned his gaze to the window. "Pity? You've become exactly what I hoped you wouldn't. A cold copy of your father." The mention of Paul Henry Walker brought forth memories that Robert preferred to forget. His father had been a brilliant businessman and utterly inadequate as a human being, treating employees like objects, family as an extension of the company, and emotions as signs of unacceptable weakness. "My father built an empire," he said, in an automatic defense developed over decades. "Your father destroyed everything he touched, the marriage to your mother, the relationship with you, the trust of the employees. The only empire he built was one of fear and resentment." Mrs. Johnson stood up and walked to the shelf, picking up the old photograph. "This boy here used to tell me his problems. He cried when he saw his father yelling at the employees. He asked why people had to be cruel to one another." She returned to sit, holding the photo in her hands. "One day, when you were about 14, you said that when you grew up, you would be different, that you would treat everyone with respect. And I do. You treat employees like numbers on a spreadsheet. You discarded your own daughter because she didn't fit into your plans, and now you show interest in my granddaughter as if she were a business opportunity." Each word was as sharp as a blade. Robert felt exposed, stripped of the armor he had built to protect himself from the world. "Mrs. Johnson, I don't want to harm Daisy. I want to help her." "How? By offering money, paying for private school, turning her into a female version of you? She has extraordinary talent. She deserves opportunities. She is 8 years old." Mrs. Johnson exploded, standing up abruptly. "She's a child who needs to play, run, make friends, not a calculator to satisfy your ego." The silence that followed was heavy with decades of accumulated resentment. Mrs. Johnson breathed heavily, as if she had finally released words held back for too long. "Do you know what happened to me after I was fired from your house?" Robert shook his head. "I was unemployed for 6 months. 6 months living off a cousin's charity, looking for work, hearing no because I was too old at 42. She turned back to the window, watching the street's activity. When I finally got another job, I earned half of what I made there. I never managed to stabilize financially again. Mrs. Johnson, I didn't know. Of course you didn't know. To you, employees are disposable. Fire one today, hire another tomorrow, problem solved. Robert stood up, moving closer to her. If I could go back in time. But you can't, and that's why I don't trust you around Daisy. Because I know that when she is no longer useful, you will discard her just like your father discarded me. The final accusation echoed in the apartment like a definitive sentence. Mrs. Johnson turned to him, and for the first time, Robert saw tears in her eyes. Leave, Robert, and if you have a shred of the kindness you had as a boy, leave my granddaughter alone. He left the apartment in shock, descending the stairs like an automaton. Outside, the fine drizzle soaked him, his $3,000 Italian suit, but he didn't even notice. For the first time in his life, Robert Henry Walker was forced to see the man he had become through the eyes of someone who knew him before the armor had formed, and he didn't like what he saw at all. Chapter 5. Revelations and Rivalries. April arrived with an unexpected chill that made New York City don coats stored away since the previous winter. Robert spent the first weeks of autumn in a forced introspection that deeply disturbed his business routine. Mrs. Johnson's words echoed in his mind during important meetings, making him question decisions he had previously made automatically. It was during one of those melancholic afternoons that Sarah entered his office with an expression of urgency he knew all too well. Mr. Walker, we have a serious problem. Smith Construction just won the bid for the Riverside Shopping Center. Robert lifted his eyes from the financial reports, trying to focus on the present. What do you mean? Our proposal was 20% below the competition. That's right. Their proposal was even lower, impossible, to execute profitably, according to our calculations. The information hit Robert like a cold shower. Smith Construction had been his main rival for 2 decades, led by Richard Smith, a man who mixed technical competence with a business aggressiveness that bordered on unethical. Losing bids to him was particularly humiliating. Bring me all the details of their proposal. I want to understand how they achieved those numbers. 3 hours later, Sarah returned with a folder full of documents obtained through official transparency channels. Robert examined each spreadsheet with the precision of a forensic auditor, searching for clues about how Smith had managed to submit such a competitive proposal. What he discovered left him perplexed and furious. The numbers didn't add up anywhere. Material costs were understated, labor was calculated below market rates, and profit margins were practically non-existent. It was impossible math for a company aiming for profit, unless Richard Smith had access to privileged information about his own budgets. Sarah, who had access to our calculations for Riverside? The usual suspects: you, me, engineer Mark, accountant Paula, and the budgeting department staff. Anyone else? Well, you asked me to leave copies in the internal audit folder. The folks at Ferreira and Associates had access for the monthly review. Ferreira and Associates was the auditing firm that provided services to various construction companies in New York, including some smaller firms linked to the Smith Group. Robert felt his blood boil as he realized how confidential information could have leaked. That very afternoon, something even more disturbing happened. On his way home, he decided to pass by Daisy's Street, a habit he had developed despite Mrs. Johnson's warnings. To his surprise, he saw a young woman animatedly talking to the girl at the entrance of the building. Even from a distance, he immediately recognized the upright posture and expressive gestures. It was Isabella, his daughter. He parked a few blocks away and walked back, keeping discreetly behind a tree. The conversation seemed relaxed and friendly, with Daisy gesturing excitedly as she showed something in a school notebook. "It can't be a coincidence," he murmured to himself. When Isabella said goodbye and headed to her car, Robert intercepted her at the corner. "What an incredible coincidence to find you here," he said, trying to keep a casual tone. Isabella turned, more irritated than surprised. "Dad, are you following me now? I'm coming back in from work and see my daughter on a street that's miles from your apartment. It's natural to be curious." Curiosity doesn't suit you. It comes off as paranoia. They walked together to Isabella's car, a used Civic that she had insisted on buying with her own money to prove her financial independence. The glaring difference with Robert's Tesla symbolized perfectly the ideological chasm between them. "What were you doing here, Isabella?" "Getting to know the girl you've been obsessed with." The frankness of her response disarmed him. "How did you know where she lives?" "I did my research." "You're not the only one in the family who knows how to investigate people." Isabella leaned against the car, studying her father's face with a mix of sadness and frustration. "Dad, have you ever stopped to think about what this child really needs?" "She needs educational opportunities suited to her exceptional talent. She needs emotional stability. She just lost her parents 3 years ago. She's being raised by a grandmother who works as a house cleaner to support both of them. The last thing she needs is a rich man destabilizing the little security she has managed to rebuild." The information about Mrs. Johnson working as a house cleaner hit Robert like a dagger. The woman who had cared for him during his formative years was, at 62, cleaning houses to survive. "How did you find all this out?" "I talked to her for an hour. You know how to do that? By sitting, listening, and showing genuine interest in her concerns. A revolutionary technique you should try." The sarcasm in Isabella's voice was sharp, but Robert sensed something deeper behind the irritation. An old disappointment that had matured into resignation. "And what else did you discover in this enlightening conversation?" "That Daisy isn't just a child with mathematical talent. She's a traumatized girl who uses numbers as emotional refuge. When she focuses on calculations, she can temporarily forget the longing for her parents." The revelation completely transformed Robert's perception of Daisy's talent. It wasn't a natural gift to be exploited, but a defense mechanism developed by a young mind trying to cope with devastating losses. "Isabella, I didn't know." "Of course you didn't know. Because you didn't ask. You appeared in her life like a hurricane, focused only on what she could do for you, not on what you could do for her." Isabella got into the car, but before closing the door, she added, "Dad, there is the difference between helping someone and using them. You've spent so much time in the latter group that you might not even recognize the difference anymore." As the Civic drove away, Robert remained alone on the sidewalk, processing information that completely reshaped his understanding of the situation. Daisy was not a human calculator waiting to be discovered. She was a wounded child using math as emotional anesthesia, and he, without realizing it, was trying to turn her refuge into a work tool. That night, alone in the mansion in Beverly Hills, Robert made 2 decisions that would mark the coming months of his life. First, he would find out exactly how Richard Smith was obtaining privileged information about his budgets. Second, he would find a way to truly help Daisy without turning her into an extension of his own interests. The problem was that, at 57, he had no idea how to execute the second part of the plan. Outside, the drizzle continued to fall, washing the city and carrying away the illusions of a man who was slowly discovering the difference between being rich and being human. Chapter 6. Junina Festivals and Revelations. The end of May brought the unmistakable aroma of Junina festivals that began to bloom in the neighborhoods of São Paulo. Even in the Upper East Side, where tradition had been gradually suffocated by elitized urbanization, some enclaves resisted with their colorful flags and improvised bonfires in the yards of the older buildings. Robert spent the first weeks of June immersed in a discreet investigation into the information leaks benefiting Richard Smith. He had hired an independent auditing firm to review all internal processes, but the results were inconclusive. Someone with privileged access was selling corporate secrets, and this betrayal consumed him more than any financial loss. It was on a muggy Thursday that Sarah brought information that would completely change the course of his thoughts. "Mr. Walker, I received an unusual invitation. The Residents Association of Marquess Avenue is organizing a Junina festival on Saturday and invited the business owners in the area to participate." Robert looked up from the spreadsheets, intrigued. Marquess Avenue was where Mrs. Johnson and Daisy lived. "Who sent the invitation?" "A lady named Mrs. Johnson. She said she represents the organizing committee and that it would be an honor to have the presence of the important neighbors of the neighborhood." The name Mrs. Johnson made him stop everything he was doing. After the emotional confrontation in his apartment, she had not given any signs of life for over 2 months. What game was she playing now? "Sir, what should I respond?" "Tell her I will attend." Sarah couldn't hide her surprise. In 15 years of work, she had never seen her boss accept any kind of community social event. Robert Walker at a street Junina festival was as improbable as seeing him driving public transport. Saturday arrived, laden with low clouds threatening rain, but they could not dampen the enthusiasm that had taken over Marquess Avenue. Since noon, residents had been taking turns hanging flags between the buildings, setting up stalls with typical food, and organizing a small bonfire in the middle of the street, previously approved by the City Hall. Robert arrived at 7 in the evening, driving the Tesla Model S that violently contrasted with the popular cars parked in the area. He wore jeans, a concession to casualness that caused him physical discomfort, and a dress shirt without a tie, the equivalent of public nudity in his usual standards. The aroma of quentão, pamonha, and roasted corn created a welcoming atmosphere that instantly transported him back to his childhood, when Mrs. Johnson prepared these same delights during the Junina festivals at the family mansion. The irony of reliving memories from the past in the present of the woman who had created them did not go unnoticed. "Mr. Walker!" Daisy came running between the stalls, wearing a colorful cheetah dress and with her cheeks painted red, a typical characterization of the rural festivals. Her joy was contagious and absolutely genuine. "Hi, Daisy. What a beautiful festival. Grandma organized everything. She said you would come, but I didn't believe it. An important man at a street festival." The innocence of the observation made him smile for the first time in weeks. "Why do you think important men don't go to street festivals? Because they are too busy with serious things. At least that's what Grandma always says." Daisy took him by the hand with the childlike naturalness that ignores social protocols. "Come on, I'll introduce you to everyone." In the following minutes, Robert found himself being introduced to the neighborhood residents as if he were a celebrity visiting loyal subjects. Mr. Paul, retired from Volkswagen; Mrs. Rita, who sold snacks at the Bella Vista Market; Jorge, a delivery driver who worked for a 24-hour pharmacy; Carmen, a manicurist who worked from home. Ordinary people with simple lives who welcomed him with a hospitality devoid of ulterior motives. It was a completely new world for someone used only to relationships mediated by financial interest or social status. "Robert, what a pleasant surprise that you came." The feminine voice made him turn abruptly. Isabella was walking toward him carrying a tray of homemade pastries, wearing a simple dress that made her look 10 years younger. Beside her was a black woman in her 40s, smiling with familiarity. Dad, this is Carmen, my secretary, and also the coordinator of the housing project I'm developing here in the neighborhood. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in Robert's mind. Isabella had not discovered Daisy by chance. She had been working in the area for months, developing social projects that he had always dismissed as youthful idealism. "Nice to meet you, Carmen," he said, extending his hand. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Walker. Your daughter talks a lot about you." Carmen's cordial tone could not completely hide a certain reserve, as if she knew more about him than she was letting on. "Dad, I need to show you something," Isabella said, leading him to one of the stalls where architectural drawings were displayed. "This is the urban revitalization project I'm working on, proposing to the city council." The designs showcased a detailed plan to transform vacant lots in the area into small community parks, complete with a playground, sports court, and a community center. It was high-quality professional work, far beyond the utopian projects he had always imagined. "Isabella, this is impressive." "Thank you. I hope to get approval and funding in the coming months." The party continued around them, but Robert was absorbed in examining the details of his daughter's project. Each element had been thoughtfully designed to meet the real needs of the community with creative and economically viable solutions. How much would it cost to execute all of this? "Why? Are you interested in investing in cheap sentimentality?" Isabella replied with irony, but without real hostility. Before he could respond, an accordion began to play from across the street, drawing everyone's attention to an improvised stage where a trio of musicians was preparing to liven up the night. "Let's dance the quadrilla," shouted Daisy, appearing once again beside Robert. "Everyone has to join in." "I don't dance quadrilla," he protested, but the girl was already organizing the pairs. "Of course you do. Grandma said that when you were little you loved these parties." Mrs. Johnson appeared like a vision in the crowd, wearing a blue floral dress that rejuvenated her by decades. Her eyes met Robert's for a moment, conveying a complex message he couldn't fully decipher. "Mrs. Johnson," he greeted, removing an imaginary hat in an old-fashioned gesture of respect. "Mr. Robert, thank you for accepting our invitation." There was a careful formality in the interaction, as if they were both walking on eggshells. But there was also something more, a kind of tacit truce that allowed for that moment of civility. The quadrilla began with traditional chords, and Robert found himself pulled into the center of the street by Daisy, who insisted on being his dance partner. The movements were simple, balance, anaman, dosiado, but his lack of practice turned them into involuntary comedy. "Relax, Mr. Robert. Just follow the music," Daisy shouted between laughs, trying to guide him through the basic steps. Around them, couples of all ages danced with the naturalness of those who had grown up with these traditions. Isabella twirled in her husband Paul's arms, Mrs. Johnson paired with Jorge the delivery guy, and even Carmen had found a partner among the neighbors. It was a world of simplicity and authenticity that Robert had never experienced. No one there cared about his wealth, his businesses, or his social status. For 2 hours, he was just a neighbor trying not to step on his little partner's toes. When the music stopped and applause echoed down the street, Daisy hugged him tightly. "Thank you for dancing with me, Mr. Robert. It was the best quadrilla of my life." In that moment, observing the girl's genuine smile and feeling the warmth of the community around him, Robert understood something that all his business achievements had never taught him. There was a wealth that could not be accounted for in spreadsheets or deposited in banks. And perhaps that was exactly what he had always lost along his journey to the top. Chapter 7. Storms and Betrayals. July arrived with the dry cold typical of winter in New York, bringing with it a series of events that would irreversibly shake the foundations of Robert's life. The community party had planted a seed of restlessness in his soul, but it was the events of mid-month that forced a complete re-evaluation of his priorities. On the morning of Monday the 15th, Sarah entered his office with an expression he had never seen in 15 years of working together. His secretary, usually unflappable, was visibly trembling as she held an official envelope. "Mr. Walker, we've received a summons from the IRS. Special audit, 30-day deadline to present all tax documentation from the last 5 years." Robert snatched the envelope from her hands, quickly reading the official document. The text was technical and bureaucratic, but his business experience automatically translated the implications. Someone had reported serious irregularities in his companies, and now the federal government wanted to scrutinize every cent of his operations. "This is impossible. Our books are clean, all taxes paid on time." "Sir, there's more," Sarah interrupted, extending a second folder. "Smith Construction won 3 more bids this week, all with proposals impossible to execute profitably." Robert examined the documents with growing disbelief. Richard Smith was not just winning bids, he was systematically destroying the competitiveness of all the major construction companies in New York with offers that defied basic economic logic. "Sarah, call an emergency meeting with all the directors. I want to know who has access to our proposals before they are sent out." "I've already done that, sir. The meeting is at 2 o'clock. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of tense phone calls and document analysis. Robert tried to maintain the calm exterior that had always characterized his leadership, but internally he felt, for the first time in decades, a sensation he hadn't experienced since adolescence: genuine fear of losing everything. The afternoon meeting was an exercise in mutual suspicion and corporate paranoia. His oldest directors, men he had personally promoted and trusted for years, looked at each other with distrust, each trying to prove their innocence through veiled accusations against their colleagues. "Someone is selling our information to Smith," Robert said, observing each face around the conference table. "And this same person probably provided material for the report to the IRS." "Mr. Walker," said Marcos, the chief engineer, "perhaps we should consider the possibility of industrial espionage. Offices wiretapped, computers hacked." "I've already thought of that. I hired a security company to conduct a complete sweep. They found nothing." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Everyone knew that the betrayal was coming from within, but no one wanted to verbalize the suspicions that hung in the air like a toxic cloud. It was during this atmosphere of distrust that Robert made a decision that surprised even him. He himself. Instead of going home after work, he headed to Mrs. Johnson's apartment. He needed to talk to someone who had no interest in his company or his fortune. He found Daisy playing alone in the building's yard, stacking pebbles in complex geometric patterns. Even her play involved math, a confirmation of Isabella's observation that numbers were his emotional refuge. "Hi, Mr. Robert, what a nice surprise." "Hi, Daisy, is your grandma home?" "She's making dinner. Want to come up?" Mrs. Johnson answered the door wearing the same floral apron she had on during his first visit months ago. Her expression shifted from cordial surprise to concern when she noticed Robert's emotional state. "Is something wrong?" "Can I come in? I need to talk to someone who doesn't want anything from me." The vulnerability in his voice seemed to disarm Mrs. Johnson's defenses. She opened the door completely, gesturing for him to enter. "Daisy, go finish your homework. The adults need to talk." Mrs. Johnson served coffee without asking questions, waiting for him to organize his thoughts. Robert remained silent for long minutes, observing the humble surroundings that radiated more peace than his $2 million mansion. "I think I'm going to lose everything," he finally said. "Do you want to talk about it?" Robert told her everything: the federal audit, the lost bids, the suspicions of internal betrayal. Mrs. Johnson listened without judgment, occasionally asking practical questions that demonstrated surprising understanding of the business world. "Do you suspect anyone specific?" "That's the problem. It could be any of my directors, men I've trusted for decades. Or it could be someone you don't even imagine," Mrs. Johnson observed gently. "What do you mean?" "Robert, have you ever stopped to think how many people have motives to harm you? Fired employees, disgruntled competitors, families displaced by your developments?" The question made him reflect on decades of business decisions made without considering the human impact. How many lives had he affected in the name of efficiency and profit? "Mrs. Johnson, do you think I deserve what's happening?" She took her time to respond, carefully weighing her words. "I think you're reaping what you sowed, but that doesn't mean it's too late to plant different things." At that moment, Daisy appeared in the living room, carrying a school notebook. "Mr. Robert, can I show you something?" She opened the notebook to a page filled with numbers organized in columns. "I was doing some calculations about those papers you showed me last week." Robert frowned. "What papers?" "Daisy. The ones the pretty lady brought. She said they were yours and that I could help check them." Robert's blood ran cold. "What pretty lady?" "Your daughter, Isabella. She came here with some papers full of numbers and asked me to take a look." Mrs. Johnson and Robert exchanged increasingly alarmed glances. Had Isabella brought company documents for Daisy to analyze, without his authorization or knowledge? "Daisy, what kind of numbers were they?" "Construction stuff. Prices for bricks, cement, that kind of thing. There were some mistakes in the calculations, so I fixed them." Robert took the notebook with trembling hands. There, in Daisy's childish handwriting, were precise corrections of spreadsheets he recognized as belonging to recent bids they had lost to Richard Smith. "Mrs. Johnson, I need to use your phone, now." He called Isabella with fingers shaking from anger and despair. "Isabella, were you here at Mrs. Johnson's house with company documents?" "Dad? What are you talking about?" "Daisy said you brought spreadsheets for her to check. Confidential documents from our construction company." The silence on the line lasted an eternity. When Isabella finally responded, her voice was heavy with a sadness he had never heard before. "Dad, I never brought your documents to Daisy. I wouldn't even know how to access them." "Then who was it?" "I don't know. But Dad, someone is using your daughter's image to manipulate an 8-year-old child." The call ended, leaving Robert alone with the terrible realization that the betrayal in his company was not just coming from within. Someone was using Daisy as an unconscious tool of industrial espionage, exploiting her innocence and talent to destroy him. And the worst part was that this person knew intimate details about his family to impersonate Isabella. The storm that had begun with a tax audit was now revealing itself as a personal hurricane, threatening to destroy not only his business, but all the people he had begun to truly care about. Chapter 8. Connections from the Past. The August Sunday dawned with a dense fog covering New York like a grey cloak, perfectly mirroring Robert's emotional state. He had spent the previous night at the office, rummaging through old files and employee records, trying to identify who could be behind the sophisticated sabotage operation that was destroying his company. The discovery that someone was impersonating Isabella to manipulate Daisy had turned a business crisis into something deeply personal. It was no longer just about money or business. It was about protecting an innocent child who was being used as a pawn in a deadly game. Around 10 in the morning, he decided to do something he hadn't done in decades: search the basement of the family mansion for old documents. Perhaps some record from the past could provide clues about who had enough knowledge about his family to execute that ruse. The basement in Beverly Hills was a dusty museum of abandoned memories. Yellowed cardboard boxes held decades of documents, photographs, and personal items he had deliberately ignored for years. It was like excavating a tomb of his own history. In the third box, he found something that made his heart stop. A photo album from the 1990s with images of the house during the holiday season. There was Mrs. Johnson, young and smiling, setting the Christmas table while he, an awkward teenager, helped decorate the tree. But it was in a folder of labor documents that he found the piece that... It was the missing piece of the puzzle, a reference letter dated 1995, handwritten by his father to recommend Mrs. Johnson to other families after her dismissal due to domestic restructuring. The ornate handwriting of Paul Henry Walker described Mrs. Johnson as an exemplary employee, discreet and absolutely trustworthy. At the end of the letter, a paragraph that almost made Robert spill his coffee. Mrs. Johnson took exceptional care of my grandson during the 2 years that the boy stayed with us after the passing of my children, Paul Jr. and Mary Claire, in the 1993 accident. Her dedication to little Edward was crucial for his emotional recovery. Edward, his nephew, the son of his younger brother. Suppressed memories came rushing back like an avalanche. Paul Jr. had married against the family's wishes to a middle-class girl, causing a permanent rift with their father. When the couple died in a car accident, Paul Henry had taken custody of the 5-year-old grandson more out of legal obligation than affection. The boy had been traumatized, refusing to speak for months. It was Mrs. Johnson who patiently brought him back to life with the love and dedication that the family itself could not offer. And Edward, where was Edward now? Robert rushed down to the office and called the Human Resources Department. "Sarah, I need you to find everything about Edward Walker, my nephew. He was born in 1988. "Sir, it's 10:30 at night. It's urgent. It could be our only lead to discover who is sabotaging the company." Monday arrived with information that confirmed Robert's worst fears. Edward Walker, orphaned at 5, had grown up in boarding schools paid for by a family estate pension. He graduated in engineering from Columbia University, worked at several small construction companies, and according to the most recent records, was a minority partner at Smith Construction. His own nephew, raised by Mrs. Johnson and abandoned by the family, was using privileged information to systematically destroy his business empire. The irony was devastating. The boy that Mrs. Johnson had emotionally saved was now using that past to take revenge on the uncle who had forgotten him. That afternoon, Robert did something he never imagined he would do. He requested a meeting with Richard Smith. The office of the rival construction company was located in Silicon Valley, in a modern building but without the ostentatious luxury that characterized Walker Tower. Richard Smith was a burly 50-year-old man with graying hair and a predatory smile that never hid his satisfaction in surpassing competitors. "Robert Walker requesting a meeting with me." "I must be dreaming," Smith said, gesturing for him to sit in a faux leather armchair. "Richard, let's get straight to the point. I know you have an informant in my company. Prove it. Edward Walker, my nephew, your partner." Smith's expression changed instantly. The predatory smile turned into a mask of professional caution. "Edward is a talented engineer who has brought some interesting opportunities to our company. He is using an 8-year-old child to spy on my documents, Richard. An orphan child who lost her parents in an accident. Doesn't that bother you at all?" The accusation genuinely surprised Smith. He stood up, walking to the window that offered a view of the city. "What child?" "Daisy Santos, granddaughter of Mrs. Johnson, who worked for my family for years. Edward is posing as my daughter to convince the girl to correct spreadsheets that are, in fact, stolen confidential documents." Richard Smith remained silent for long minutes. When he turned around, his expression had completely changed. "Robert, I knew Edward had access to privileged information about your bids. I always imagined it was traditional industrial. Espionage, a disgruntled employee, wiretaps, that kind of thing. I never imagined it involved a child. And now that you know, now I need to make a decision. Edward is a minority partner, but the contacts and information he has brought have been crucial to our recent successes." Smith sat back down, studying Robert's face as if he were seeing him for the first time. "What did you come here to do? Ask me to dismiss my partner? Offer money? Threaten with a lawsuit?" "I came to ask you to be human. A child is being manipulated by someone who should be protecting her. Regardless of the business between us, this has to stop." The response seemed to completely disarm Smith. In 20 years of business rivalry, he had never seen Robert Walker put personal issues above financial interests. "You've changed, Robert. The man I knew would never come here to make an emotional appeal. Maybe the man you knew was exactly the problem." Richard Smith stood up, extending his hand in a gesture of truce. "I will talk to Edward. If what you are saying is true, our partnership is over, regardless of the financial loss." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Edward is your nephew, your family problem. You will have to face the consequences of what he has become." As he returned home, Robert reflected on the cruel irony of fate. The boy that Mrs. Johnson had cared for with such love had grown up hating the family that abandoned him, using that hatred to construct an elaborate and destructive revenge. And at the center of this war was Daisy, an innocent child being manipulated by the same man who had once been raised by her grandmother. The web of past connections was closing in on all of them like an inevitable trap, and Robert was beginning to understand that some past mistakes accrued compounded interest that never stopped growing. That night, for the first time in months, he called Isabella with a single purpose: to tell the truth about Edward and ask for help to protect Daisy, because he had finally understood that some battles could not be won alone. Chapter 9. The Confrontation and Forgiveness. September arrived, bringing a timid spring that could barely warm the cold that had settled in Robert's heart. 3 days had passed since the revelation about Edward, and he could not sleep properly, tormented by a mix of guilt, anger, and a desperate urgency to protect. It was on a rainy Thursday that Isabella appeared in his office unannounced, accompanied by a woman he did not immediately recognize. Only when she turned to greet him did Robert realize he was facing the real Isabella, or rather, someone impersonating her. "Dad, this is Laura, my maternal cousin. She has something important to tell you." Laura was a woman in her 30s, with a similar height and physique to Isabella. Dressed casually, she could easily be mistaken for her daughter by a child who had only seen them in passing. "Mr. Walker," Laura said with a trembling voice, "I need to confess something terrible that I did." Robert felt his stomach tighten. "Go on." "Edward hired me 3 months ago to impersonate Isabella and get close to the girl living on Marquis Avenue. He said it was to help with some calculations for a social project Isabella was developing." "And you accepted?" "He paid me $5,000 to visit the girl a few times and ask her to check some spreadsheets. He said it was to test her math skills for a scholarship. It seemed innocent until Isabella approached me and I discovered the whole truth." Laura began to cry, wiping her eyes with a crumpled tissue. "Mr. Walker, I swear I didn't know I was hurting anyone. Edward convinced me it was a charitable project. Where is he now?" "I don't know. Since Isabella contacted me, he has disappeared. He doesn't answer his phone, isn't at his apartment, or at Smith Construction." Isabella approached her father's desk, placing a folder of documents on the polished mahogany. Dad, I managed to trace some of Edward's activities over the past few years. What I found will shock you even more. Robert opened the folder, revealing photographs, bank statements, and documents that told a devastating story. Edward had spent the last 15 years building a detailed file on the Walker family, collecting information about fired employees, cancelled projects, and families harmed by demolitions. He has been preparing this for a long time, Isabella explained. The approach to Richard Smith was just the first step. Edward wanted to destroy our company completely. But why? What did we do that was so terrible to him? Isabella sighed deeply, as if the answer was too obvious. To explain. Dad, you abandoned him. A 5-year-old boy who had just lost his parents was left in boarding schools and forgotten by his own family. The only person who showed him kindness was Mrs. Johnson, and even she was fired when he needed her most. The accusation was like a blade to the chest. Robert tried to remember Edward as a boy, but the images were vague and distorted by time. He vaguely recalled a quiet and withdrawn boy who had spent some years haunting the mansion like a ghostly presence. Isabella, I need to talk to him. Where do you think he might be? I only know one place where he could feel safe, with the only person who really cared for him as a child. Mrs. Johnson's apartment was silent when they arrived. It was almost noon on Saturday, and Robert expected to find Daisy playing in the yard, but there was no sign of the girl or her grandmother. Maybe they went out, Isabella suggested. Or maybe they're having a visitor, Robert murmured, feeling a tightness in his chest. They climbed the stairs to the second floor. The door to apartment 23 was ajar, and voices came from inside, a tense discussion among adults trying to keep their voices low so as not to scare a child. Robert knocked gently on the door, which swung open completely, revealing a scene that shattered him. Daisy was sitting at the kitchen table, tears streaming down her face, while a man in his mid-30s, tall, thin, with the green eyes characteristic of the Walker family, was trying to explain something to her. Edward. Daisy, please, you don't understand. Uncle Robert is a bad person who hurts families. I just wanted to protect you, Edward said desperately. But you lied to me. The girl cried. You said you were Mr. Robert's daughter, but you weren't. And now Grandma is mad, and I don't understand anything. Mrs. Johnson stood beside her granddaughter, a protective hand on the child's shoulder, her face marked by a mix of anger and sadness that Robert had never seen before. Edward, stop this conversation. You're traumatizing the girl. It was then that Edward noticed Robert and Isabella at the door, his face contorted into a mask of pure hatred that completely transformed his features. Look who showed up, the beloved uncle who didn't even remember I existed. Edward, we need to talk, Robert said, trying to keep his voice calm. Talk about what? About how you and your father abandoned me in a boarding school and never looked back? About how you fired the only person who cared about me? I didn't fire Mrs. Johnson. It was my father. And where were you when that happened? Why didn't you stop it? Why did you never look for me afterward? The questions echoed in the small apartment like relentless accusations. Robert had no answers, because the truth was simple and devastating. He had been young, selfish, and completely oblivious to the suffering of an orphaned boy. Edward, you're right. We failed you in an unforgivable way, he finally said. But that doesn't justify using Daisy to get revenge. I didn't use her. I protected her. By lying about your identity, by having her check stolen documents without knowing what she was doing, is that protection? Edward opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. For the first time, he seemed to be truly looking at Daisy, seeing not a tool for revenge, but a scared and confused child. It was Mrs. Johnson who broke the tense silence. Edward, you have become exactly the kind of person who used to make me cry when you were a child. Remember how you hated it when someone lied to you or used you to hurt others." The words of the old housekeeper hit Edward like a slap. His face crumpled, and for the first time, Robert could see through the mask of hatred the wounded boy still living inside the adult man. "Grandma Johnson, I just wanted them to pay for what they did," he murmured, using the same affectionate nickname from his childhood. "And you thought hurting an innocent child would fix your pain?" Daisy stood up from her chair and slowly walked over to Edward. Her tears had stopped, but her eyes still sparkled with sadness. "Edward, why didn't you tell me the truth? I could have helped without all these lies." The simple and innocent question from the girl completely broke down Edward's defenses. He knelt before her, his eyes filled with tears. "Because I was so angry, Daisy. And when people are very angry, sometimes they do wrong things thinking they are right. Like when I get mad at Grandma and say mean things? Exactly, only much worse." Daisy hugged Edward with the unconditional generosity that only children possess. "Then you have to apologize, just like I do when I make a mistake." It was at that moment that Robert understood the most important lesson of his life. Forgiveness was not a reward for those who deserved it, but a gift offered by those who love, regardless of the mistakes made. And perhaps that was exactly what his family had lost over generations, the ability to love unconditionally, to forgive without reservations, to choose unity over vengeance. Looking at that child embracing the man who had used her, Robert finally understood what Mrs. Johnson had always tried to teach. That true strength comes from the ability to heal, not to hurt. Chapter 10. The Gift That Changes Everything. December arrived in New York City with that characteristic warmth that precedes the holiday season, bringing with it the aroma of gingerbread and the nostalgia of Secret Santa exchanges that began to be organized throughout the neighborhoods. But for Robert Walker, this Christmas would be completely different from all the previous ones. In the last 3 months, since the confrontation at Mrs. Johnson's apartment, much had changed. Edward had voluntarily distanced himself from Smith Construction and was undergoing therapy to deal with childhood traumas. Richard Smith, surprisingly, had honored his word and dissolved the partnership, returning the stolen documents and cooperating with the IRS audit to clarify the irregularities. But the most radical transformation had happened to Robert himself. On the morning of December 21st, he woke up not in the mansion in Beverly Hills, but in the 2-bedroom apartment he had rented on Marquis Avenue, just 2 blocks away from Mrs. Johnson and Daisy. The change had shocked everyone who knew him. From Sarah, who couldn't understand how a millionaire could choose to live in a simple apartment, to his business partners, who whispered about a possible nervous breakdown. The truth was simpler, and at the same time more complex. Robert was learning to live for the first time in his life. The 80-square-meter apartment was furnished simply a living room with a used but comfortable sofa, a small reclaimed wood dining table, 2 plain bedrooms, and a kitchen where he was, surprisingly, learning to prepare morning coffee. On that special morning, he was making a strong coffee because he had a long day ahead. It was, Christmas Eve, and for the first time in decades, he would actively participate in the neighborhood celebrations. The doorbell rang precisely at 9 o'clock. Daisy was on the other side of the door, wearing a simple red dress and carrying a school folder. "Good morning, Mr. Robert. I brought the final calculations for our foundation." In recent months, Robert had created the Daisy Foundation for Mathematical Education, an institution that identified and supported children with special talents in mathematics. But unlike his previous ventures, this foundation operated collaboratively, with Daisy as a special consultant, helping to assess the candidate's potentials. "Let's see what you discovered, Math Chief," he said, using the affectionate nickname that had naturally emerged between them. Daisy opened the folder, revealing carefully organized spreadsheets with the neat handwriting of a child who took her work very seriously. I found 15 children this month who have a special talent for numbers, but I also found 3 who need emotional help first. The wisdom of her observation impressed him, as always. Daisy had developed not only her mathematical skills, but also a remarkable intuition for identifying when numbers were an emotional refuge, as they had been for her. And what is your recommendation? For the 15 with talent, scholarships, and special classes, for the 3 who are sad, first conversations with psychologists, then math. It was exactly the kind of approach Robert would never have considered before. Caring for the person first, then for the talent, a lesson that an 8-year-old was teaching a 57-year-old businessman. Approved. I'll talk to Dr. Helen to arrange the psychological follow-up. Dr. Helen was his ex-wife, who had become a child psychologist after their divorce. Paradoxically, the creation of the foundation had brought the separated couple closer, not romantically, but as partners in a common cause. Helen was impressed by the changes she saw in her ex-husband. Mr. Robert, may I ask you something? Of course, Daisy. Is Edward coming for Christmas today? Edward had become a constant presence in everyone's lives in recent months. After months of therapy, he was working as a volunteer engineer for the foundation and slowly rebuilding the family bonds that had been broken in childhood. It was a painful but necessary process for everyone. Yes, he is. He's helping Isabella set up the tables out on the street. And has Grandma forgiven him yet? The question touched the heart of the matter. The transformation that had occurred in the makeshift family formed around Daisy. Mrs. Johnson had shown a capacity for forgiveness that humiliated Robert daily. Not only had she forgiven Edward for manipulating her granddaughter, but she had also welcomed him back as the grandson he had always been in her heart. Your grandma is wiser than all of us, Daisy. She forgave Edward the same day she discovered the truth. Because she knows that hurt people do wrong things, but they are still people, right? The simplicity with which Daisy expressed complex concepts about human nature never ceased to amaze him. That child had become his teacher in matters far more important than mathematics. Around noon, Robert and Daisy went down to the street, where the neighborhood Christmas party was already in full swing. Marquis Avenue had been closed to traffic, and long tables stretched from one sidewalk to the other, covered with checkered tablecloths and decorated with simple arrangements of flowers from the residents' gardens. "Dad!" Isabella waved from the middle of the crowd, carrying a platter of stuffing that smelled of homemade spices. Beside her, Edward was organizing borrowed chairs from various apartments, his expression focused yet serene. In recent months, the relationship between father and daughter had completely transformed. Isabella had taken on the coordination of the foundation's social projects, finally finding in her father an ally for her causes. And Robert had discovered that his daughter's passion for social justice was not naive idealism, but practical wisdom on how to build a better world. "Robert!" Mrs. Johnson appeared carrying a huge pot of rice with piquis, wearing an apron that he vaguely remembered seeing her wear decades ago. "Did you bring dessert?" "I did." He held up a bag, containing 3 milk puddings he had learned to make from YouTube tutorials. A skill he never imagined he would develop, but had become a source of personal pride. The party was a mosaic of intertwined stories. Old Paul, the retired Volkswagen worker, was telling jokes to the children while his wife organized the secret Santa drawer. Carmen, Isabella's secretary, had brought her whole family, husband, 3 kids, and mother-in-law. George, the delivery guy, was circulating among the tables serving cold soda with the contagious joy of someone who genuinely loved that community. "Attention, everyone!" shouted Mrs. Smith, tapping a fork against a glass. It's time for Secret Santa. Daisy ran to Robert, holding a small package wrapped in recycled gift paper. Mr. Robert, you are my Secret Santa. He opened the gift with careful reverence, as if it were the most precious object in the world. Inside, he found a hardcover notebook with the first page filled in the girl's neat handwriting. For my friend Robert, who taught me that the best numbers are the ones that help people be happy. Merry Christmas, Daisy. The following pages were blank, waiting to be filled with new calculations, new projects, new shared dreams. Robert felt his eyes fill with tears, something he had learned to accept in recent months. Daisy, this is the most beautiful gift I've ever received in my life. Really? 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 As the party continued around them, Robert looked at the people who had become his family. Daisy teaching fractions to a younger child, Mrs. Johnson organizing leftovers to distribute to vulnerable residents, Isabella and Edward working together to set up an extra table for neighbors who arrived unannounced, Helen talking with parents about child development. It was a wealth he had never experienced, not measured in dollars or properties, but in authentic human connections, in shared purpose, in unconditional love. At 6 in the evening, when the first stars began to appear in the Los Angeles sky, Daisy approached him again. Mr. Robert, can I ask a math question? Always. If you add up all the gifts you received today, how much does it come to? He looked around at the street full of people laughing, talking, and sharing lovingly made food. Daisy, that calculation is impossible to make. Why? Because there are things that can't be measured with numbers. Daisy smiled, hugging him with all the strength of her 8 years. So does that mean you got rich? Richer than I ever thought possible. As the Christmas party continued into the night, Robert Henry Walker finally understood the lesson that an orphan girl had begun to teach him one January afternoon. The true mathematics of life was not based on accumulation, but on multiplication, of affection, of purpose, of shared joy. The gift that had forever changed the life of a millionaire was not wrapped in golden paper, but in the smile of a child who had taught him the difference between having money and being truly rich. And for the first time in 57 years, Robert knew exactly how much he was worth.